It's fine.
Start recording on OBS. We're live on the FaceWeb. All right, you can start recording on the mixer in 5, 4, 3.
Welcome to the Black Sheep Recovery Warfare Podcast, where it is our mission to debunk the lies of the enemy and announce freedom to those still lost in the darkness and addiction.
Welcome to another episode of Black Sheep Recovery Warfare Podcast. I'm your host, Brother Phoenix, and I'm joined in the studio with my co-host, Stacy Leggett.
What's up?
Thanks again to David Dillmore at Born Again Roofing Company. David is our gold sponsor this month. We are grateful for the opportunity to work with David and his ministry. Ooh. Thank you. Thanks,
Maybe
David.
we should rehearse that one before we get this again.
Did that sound
No,
terrible?
it sounded great. You did so good.
You don't have to lie.
It was good. It's great.
Okay. Today, we have a special guest. She is an author of a book called Curious, and she has her own ministry. It is called End It for Good. Her name is Christina Dent. Welcome to the studio, Miss Dent. How are you doing today?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm doing great. Really excited to be with you guys.
Awesome. What we're going to talk about today is
How we approach drugs and addiction in a more helpful way.
Right.
the first time I heard about you was through a mutual friend of ours named Josh Hollingshead. You did an episode of Unashamed Recovery, and I did one as well. That's how I got my start in all this podcast stuff. And big shout out to Unashamed Recovery. And there were a lot of things that you said that touched me in the heart, and it's a great episode. I encourage my listeners to go check it out. But I would like for Miss Dent to share her story on the Black Sheep for my listeners.
Mm-hmm.
So tag it away.
Absolutely. So I kind of come to this, and I'll just say it up front. I don't have any background experience, personal experience with substance use, addiction, that sort of thing. And so even the work that I do with End It for Good today, and I'll go into some of the story of how I got here, but even all of that, I'm always acutely aware I have not paid the price other people have who work in this space. I don't have the personal experience I have. And yet, I think my experiences, what brought me here, and what I learned along the way can be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Even still. I was talking about that with a mom whose daughter has struggled with addiction for a long time. And I said, I don't have lived experience. And she said, you do have lived experience. It's just of a different sort. It's
Right.
just a different kind of lived experience. And so all of us need to use all the tools that we have available to us to be able to help others.
I like that perspective because, like, I work in a substance abuse treatment center. And so often our clients are like, I have to have a therapist who's been through addiction. And while there is incredible value to that, sometimes I think that it is also powerful to have someone who hasn't struggled in that way come in with an objective perspective, and who sees a little bit of a different, side of what is addiction and how does it affect other people, not just how does it affect me from my perspective as an addict. So I think that, what do they say? It takes a village. Sometimes I think it takes a lot of different perspectives and lived experiences to treat what is the reality of addiction.
Yeah. Yeah. So I came into this not through substance use. I actually grew up in a very conservative environment. I was never exposed to substance use. I didn't even really have friends whose parents drank alcohol. It just wasn't really part of my world at all.
God bless you.
And
Man.
I'm like, I wonder what that's like.
I'm talking about when I was growing up, it's like, I couldn't leave the house without getting exposed to something,
It really was it seemed
Sheltered.
normal to me growing up, but very sheltered. And I guess, so my experiences with it really were my neighbors. We had a lot of people who moved in and out of the houses near us. I grew up in West Jackson in a lower income area.
Wait. You grew up in West
hold on
Jackson?
now. I said, let me get this straight. You grew up in West Jackson and you had no exposure.
Look at God is all I got to say about it.
Won't he do it?
Won't he do it?
So I was in West Jackson.
What part of West Jackson? Because I'm familiar.
Yeah, so I grew up right off Clinton Boulevard.
I used to have a house over on Vanderbilt.
Okay, so I grew up like
right from the Queens.
Yeah, I grew up across the street from the Queens.
Okay,
That's
Wait,
why
how-
I can't.
how
My
did that
brain
happen?
won't.
How
I
did
can't
you-
put that together.
I can't either.
Yes.
How did you get through
So
life?
I'll give you a little more backstory than
Please
I would typically
do.
give on this. But so my parents moved here so that my dad could go to Reformed Theological Seminary, which
Yeah.
is
No,
right
it's
next
right
to
there.
the Queens in West Jackson. And so he went to school there. I was born while they were in seminary. And then when he graduated, they moved like a block away. They had 4 little kids. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad had like a part-time job somewhere. I mean, they had no money. And they found this little rental house. It was like 800 square feet, about a block from the seminary. And
Wow.
they moved in, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath. That was a house I grew up in my whole life until I went to college. And so it was right there. It was in a I struggled with a lot of anxiety over physical safety as a child because there was
Rightfully
a
so.
lot of,
Yeah, for sure.
a lot of gunshots daily, police sirens all the time. I mean, it just was
Very
something
stressful.
that is, and my neighbors were held up. I tell that story actually in the book.
It's amazing you didn't get held up.
Yeah, about just how that impacted me and how later in my life, and we'll get to that, I could see in thinking about what drives addiction and people's prior experiences really being the root cause of that, it helped me to think about, even though I didn't have experiences that ended up with me in substance use, I could look back and say, I have way more concern. I have way more awareness over my physical safety. I'm 40 years old. I've lived in a safe neighborhood for the last 20 years. And yet I still lock my doors, even if I'm at home. Like it doesn't leave you. What you experience as a child does not leave you. It impacts you. And that's ongoing many times for the rest of our lives. And so it really was a great family. It had a wonderfully supportive family, wonderful childhood home life, kind of dropped in the middle of a chaos area.
Right.
So my neighbors, lots of chaos there, lots of alcohol,
Yes, and I can identify with that because when I was growing up, I spent a lot of time in that area not because I lived over there. I grew up in South Jackson, but my grandmother, Verna Gallagher, she had an adoption. This is why your episode really touched my heart too. My grandmother, Verna Gallagher, she had an adoption ministry right by the zoo over on Louisiana Street, literally right by the Jackson Zoo. And that, even back in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and forward, it's a lot worse now, it was a horrible high crime rate area. And I spent a lot of time over there growing up around all of the children that she specialized in rescuing children out of broken homes, abusive homes and things like that. So I grew up with these kids. I was always around them, and I was always in that neighborhood and playing with them. So I was exposed to it, to that area and those broken, hurt children that were coming out of that. And it was just amazing to me. It blew my mind how nobody in that area fooled with my grandmother. She was probably 85 pounds soaking wet. She was obviously she was an older white lady, and that whole area was just flooded with violence and drugs, and nobody ever fooled with her.
I mean, I think that's the Lord's protection.
Yes.
I think it was on
It's
your
definitely
life and
that.
your family's life as well. But I love so much, and I say this all the time, but it is so incredibly powerful to look at the full context of a person's life before we judge the fact that they ended up in addiction or in prostitution or in gambling or whatever the thing is. It's so important to see the full context of, we didn't just get there because one day I was like, you know what, I want to make some trash decisions. I want to really mess up some people's lives. Like there's a reason. Addiction in any form that it takes is adaptive. Yeah. Addiction is adaptive. Yeah. And so we have to go back and look at, what is it that I'm trying to adapt to that I experienced earlier in life that created this emotional atmosphere of a reality that's intolerable that I'm trying to escape from.
So that makes total sense to me now, Stacey. And like 10 years ago, I had no concept of that at all. All I knew about addiction was whatever I sort of picked up from the culture.
Yep.
And that was, it's just like people making bad decisions.
Yeah.
This is, if their life is spinning out of control, it's like because they are spinning, like they are that kind of person. that would make those decisions.
Bad
And so-
people, right?
Yeah, just
Bad
a
people.
bad people. And it wasn't that I didn't have empathy for hurting people. In many ways I did. And yet now I can look back and say that empathy was very, I could turn it on and off depending on whether or not I thought somebody deserved it.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, that kind of group of like somebody who's using drugs, that wasn't an area that I felt like that's their own decision. That's
so
their
you were
thing.
kind of
And
just
so-
looking at it through like a judgmental lens. Really.
Yeah. And so it
You know,
really,
and a lot of people do that. And one of my first guests, Jelana, she judged harshly to addicts,
Mm-hmm.
but she had through Jesus Christ, she had a completely heart change over all of it. And I'd like to hear how that happened for you.
So I became a foster parent. My husband and I and our kids became a foster family when I was in my early 30s, so just really a couple of years ago. And through that experience, we fostered several different children, but with some of them, we never really had any contact with their birth families. But we fostered one little baby who came to us straight from the hospital after he was born. His mom had been using drugs while she was pregnant, which, on the realm of stigma, you're getting higher and higher stigma.
And who deserves the empathy? That hit me
Yes.
hard when you said that, because what a hard thing to judge. Who is deserving of empathy and who is not?
Yeah. And so I didn't have any context because I didn't really know anything about addiction to understand what was behind that. In my mind, it was like, wait, I'm a mom. I don't think I would have used drugs while I was pregnant. And so how could this mom do that if she really loves her son? But I got to meet her a few days after he came to our house. And I took him for his visit with her. Her name is Joanne. And she met me in the parking lot. I had not met her before. I just turned around in the parking lot to walk in for this visit. And she comes running across the parking lot, just crying, and runs over to us and starts kissing her son and talking to him. And I'm standing there awkwardly wondering, what on earth is happening? This doesn't really match what I'm anticipating. And she spends her 1 hour of visitation time with him. And she just wants to connect with him. Like every chance she gets, she asks me every little detail she can know about his life. And I take him back to our house. She goes to inpatient treatment. And she'd been using for about 20 years at this point. This was not like a new thing. This was her first child. And so really the significant level of consequence coming down on her for that prenatal drug use. And she desperately wanted to parent him and be there for him, which was hard for me to try to sort out. Like, wait, if you wanted to be with him so much, why are you using drugs while you're pregnant? Like, why wasn't that enough for you to stop? And the more I got to know her, the more I saw what seemed unbelievable to me in the beginning, which is she's a mom like me. She loves her son just as much as I love my sons. Yeah. And her addiction is not a lack of love. It's not this moral failure because she's a terrible person.
Yes.
It really is driven by other things. At that point, I didn't know what else would drive it, because all I had ever really known was kind of what society tells you, which is this very stigmatized picture of that. But it set me on a learning journey of the more I got to know her. She would call me from treatment and ask me to put her on speakerphone, and she would sing to him over the phone. He's this little 5-pound, 9-ounce, like tiny preemie who's sleeping all the time. And just having that front row seat to her love. And she deserves all the credit for that, because she let me in on an incredibly vulnerable experience. For a mom to be separated from her child, to try to find a way to connect with them, even though you can't hold them, you can't really talk to them, you can't, all the ways you would normally connect with a child, with your baby, she can't. She's 3 hours away. So she took every opportunity that she could.
Amen.
Even though it was in front of me, a stranger that she doesn't know. And in many ways, that could have been a very negative relationship, because I'm the one who, has been deemed fit to parent her child right now, even though I don't know him at all. He's, not related to me. And yet she didn't approach it that way. She approached it as, I am going to do everything that I can to connect with him and it was just so vulnerable. A vulnerability that continues to inspire me to like lean in and let people see who you are.
Yeah.
She changed my life
Well,
by letting me see herself.
I was just going to say, yes, we're giving her credit for the way that she chose to respond to that, but you also could have made that process for her painful and challenging and full of judgment if you had wanted to, but you didn't.
Well, the warfare is there, you know, in my mind. It's like, oh, is this real? Is it not real? It's easier if it's not real. Like, it's easier if I can kind of like X her out of the picture and be like, yeah, I've made the judgment and I can move on.
Yeah.
And she just didn't let me do that. And I would say it's because the Lord didn't let me do that. And he gave her the strength and the courage to be able to lean in a really tough situation. And I'm just incredibly thankful.
Is Joanne clean now?
She is. She's been sober since he was a baby.
Really?
That's so that example is so powerful.
Yeah.
Because that is one of the how do I say this? The way that addiction is so just deceptive and terrible in that the love is really there. There really is love. There really is remorse. There really is hatred towards ourselves and the things that we're doing. But the ability for my brain to make the logical consequence that or decision that I want to make is not there. I'm steady. What does Paul say? Things I want to do, I don't do, and things I don't want to do, it's what I find myself doing. Yeah. And that is addiction. I don't want to do what I'm doing, but I don't. With all the might that I have, I cannot seem to make myself stop doing that until there's a net thrown over me and I give my brain a chance to heal. Right? And it's just, it's so important to have examples like that out there for people who, kind of similar to your story, don't really know much about it. And so just judge it in the way that anybody who wasn't familiar with it would.
Yeah. So that really started me on this learning journey. It was kind of like, whoa, wait a second. I've had this really paradigm shift experience with Joanne. She's helped me to see the person behind the addiction. She's helped me to see this is people like me. This moms like me. This is, in many ways, I didn't learn this until after Beckham was already reunited with her. We had very similar childhoods growing up. I was homeschooled. She was homeschooled. We were both one of 4 children. We both grew up in Jackson. We both grew up in loving families. I mean, there was so much that the more I learned, the more we eventually realized that our parents actually knew each other when we were younger. Wow. We never knew each other. But when you were homeschooling in Mississippi in the 80s, like there was like 80 people homeschooling back then. It was not the movement that it is today. So the parents, they would meet at conferences or whatever, as people are trying to figure out, what do we teach our children at home?
It's amazing to me what God will do and what He'll do to the circumstances He will create to put people in your life to change your whole outlook on something that something that you struggle with as far as like judgment goes. So literally, God puts somebody in her life to have that paradigm shift to change your whole outlook on addiction the way you have.
And now look what you've chosen to do with the fresh revelation that God has given you.
And what have you chosen to do?
So what I did, now if you would have told me even at that point that I would be doing what I'm doing today, which is a lot of this, talking to people about shifting the way we approach drugs and addiction, and not just people who are using drugs, but even rethinking how we approach drug markets and all of that, I would have said you are so crazy.
Yeah.
So crazy. But it really started me on this journey of learning. And that journey started with how can we help people like Joanne, kind of on the consumer side, people who are using drugs. How can we help them make healthier choices, whether they're addicted or not? How can we make sure they don't die from an overdose that's accidental? That can happen to anyone, addicted or not, if you're using substances that you can't dose appropriately. And so that learning journey started. I started reading, I started talking with people, ended up completely shifting my perspective on what I think the best solutions are. So I would say today I'm at a place where health-centered approaches to drug use and addiction, approaching it as this is a really complex health issue. It might have spiritual components, it might have mental health components, but it is not a criminal justice issue. It is not this person just needs a slap on the wrist. They need an arrest. That's going to fix the problem.
Let's give them more pain and more stigma to try
Yeah.
to treat the pain and stigma that they already have.
Yes, it is pouring gasoline on
Brilliant.
fire. It
Yeah.
is.
I've thought about this a lot. Like one of my first like big girl jobs was working at a police department, and it was still a person in recovery at that time, and seeing people like me come in over and over and over and over and over again, I was like, they're not going to change because we take them away from drugs and alcohol for 6 months to a year to 5 years,
And
right?
cost them a ton of money.
And it goes back to what we were just talking about, the context. Like I have to go back into what are the broken places, right? What are the places that the unresolved emotional dysfunction that's continuing to take you back out? Like that has to be solved. And that, now I will say that like the way that some of our jails and prisons are today, that they have so much more resources than they've ever had as far as like addiction and recovery and, trying to help people with their internal stuff. But more often than not, people just I'm going to punish you into right behavior. And how many of us have figured out that shame is a really poor motivator, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you can even look at if you just look at outcomes and say, why is it then that we keep arresting the same people over and over
Right.
again? If it worked, it would
Right.
take one time, maybe two, and it would be solved.
Mhm.
That is not the way that's not the way that it works.
Right.
It's not the way most people find recovery or make different choices related to substance use, because they're not making that choice because, hey, I don't think I'm going to get caught. They're making it because it's doing something for them.
It's survival.
Drugs are doing
Yeah.
something for them, and the pain of an arrest, if you can't figure out how to fill the part that drugs are
Mm-hmm.
currently filling with something that is better, the real thing that they really need. And I think, honestly, I think even though my experience has not been one of using drugs, I think the more that I learned about drugs, the more I realized this is how I use food.
Yeah.
Like, I don't get
Yeah,
arrested
for sure.
that. Like,
Uh-huh.
nobody's going to arrest me for eating half the cake or whatever. But, like, it really helped me to understand my own behaviors that aren't stigmatized
Mhm.
and they're not criminalized, but they are still driven by a lot of the same things, where I'm sitting there eating the cake going,
Yeah.
I don't even want the cake.
I feel
don't
attacked.
even feel like,
I'm so attacked right now. I'm not ready for this conversation, actually.
And it's still, that is still, and maybe till the day I die, is
Yeah.
going to be something for me that's like, this is the thing I struggle with.
Uh-huh.
This is where I go when I don't want to feel whatever it is that I'm feeling. Half the time, I don't even know what that is. I just end up at the cabinet
Yeah.
going, where did those cookies go?
Yeah.
Almost
It's not-
animalistic, right?
Yeah, it's not like somebody's going to put you in cuffs over that. you know?
Right, yes.
But you can shred apart your health in that way.
Sure.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely can be incredibly negative. And it's negative even in the fact that it's not helping me to
Right.
address what's really going on inside. And so, good therapist has been helping me figure that out.
Yay.
Can you tell us what ended all, or ended for? I keep doing that. What can you tell us? What
Just end it
for-
all.
Yes.
Can you tell us what ended for good?
Everything.
What
Yes.
the nonprofit that you started is all about?
Yeah,
What you do?
so I started after some reading and doing research and really changing my mind about how we approach drugs and addiction. I started hosting book discussions, first in Jackson, then in other parts of the state, using a book called Chasing the Scream. Would highly recommend it to listeners. It is the last 100 years of what we've done with drugs and addiction and what the outcomes have been.
Oh, I've got to get
And-
that.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's so good. It's very story driven. This is not like a policy book that you're like, oh, my
Thank you,
gosh,
God,
I'm, like,
for that.
sleeping.
For sure.
You know? It's really gripping.
Well, it doesn't have pictures.
No pictures.
Okay,
No,
John.
you gotta-
Okay.
I'm out.
What do you want pictures of? The drugs? I mean, we're trying to help people
Not
get
to do
sober.
that.
Well,
Yeah.
I went to school in South Jackson, so I'm not good of a reader.
It's okay.
I wasn't homeschooled like some people. I'm just kidding.
So I started hosting those book discussions, and people were really interested in coming. They came and they were curious about other solutions. And some of the solutions in that book are rethinking drug markets. Can we bring some substances back into some sort of legal regulation so that we have quality control over them? We make sure they're not contaminated with fentanyl. You can have age restrictions on purchase, things like that. And those ideas challenged me. I ended up coming to believe that they're the best solution of the imperfect ones that we have. And I was shocked to see how many other people were open to that. So it was people who were in law enforcement, people who were attorneys, people in the medical community, people in recovery, people who had family members still struggling with addiction. Lots of different people came. And over time, it just became clear there's something here. People want better solutions. We don't all agree on what those solutions are, and that's okay. But they want an opportunity to explore and not just keep doing the same thing we've been doing over and over again and somehow hoping it's going to be different. And so I started End It for Good in 2019 after about 2 years of those book discussions. And it has continued to grow from there. So our mission is inviting people to support approaches to drugs that prioritize life, that preserve families, and promote public safety. So we don't want to sacrifice anybody's interest to elevate somebody else's, but rather say we want people who are using substances to stay alive, first of all. They can't make any better choices. They can't find recovery if they have overdosed, if they're gone. And so,
I truly wish that I would have met you, or my sister would have met you when she was still alive before she had her overdose on fentanyl. And I think that what you're doing is great. And
well, and I'm curious too, when you say invite people to support some of these things, what does that look like?
So I would say there's 2 areas where we hope to see support. One is in culture change. One is in policy change. So it may be that people don't want to make any changes to policy. They don't want to make any changes to how the criminal justice system approaches drugs or addiction. But they might be open to culture change of helping the broader culture understand addiction, helping us be able to engage community organizations, faith communities, families to bring better education so that people are responded to in a way that helps them find healing instead of just makes the addiction worse.
I love that so much. And, you know, at the treatment center that I work at, one of the sayings that we have, and we didn't coin it, it came from a talk that somebody did, a video that we play a lot, but it's that the opposite of addiction is connection.
Yep.
And so what happens is when we shame people who are currently in addiction, that shame comes from threatened connections. So we're threatening the very thing that is most powerful in allowing people to get sober and stay sober. So we threaten that connection with those people, and that shame that they feel in response to that causes them to hide. And when we're hiding and we're isolating, the shame is growing, and then we're going deeper into the addiction. So to be able to come from like a broader societal perspective and say, what is addiction? Why is it here? What does it look like? How can we support? I can't even imagine, like, if we could do that hardcore for the next 10 years, what might addiction look like a decade from now?
I think it would certainly make a broader impact than the war on drugs that's been around since, the 50s or 60s?
Yeah.
That has done absolutely nothing
Just
but
say
make it
no.
worse.
That worked so well for me. Just say, just don't do it. Oh, okay. For sure. Got it.
So let's talk about your book. What in your book, Curious, you mentioned an experiment called Rat Park. What exactly is Rat Park?
Yeah, so I wrote Curious a couple of years in. I actually started it in 2020. So right after we became a nonprofit, I started writing it. In my mind, I was thinking, it's 2020, COVID, everything shut down for a few months. We were heavily event-oriented because we were doing these discussions all over the state. And I thought, I'll just quick churn out a book in a few months, while everything shut down. 4 years later, that book.
I was like, just spit it out in a couple of weekends, right?
Yeah, it was a really, really hard process, but I wanted to write it because so Chasing the Scream, the book that we had been doing discussions on, is incredible. It's excellent. But the author is not a believer, and he has a very different view of the role of government than I would. I'm more conservative. He's definitely more liberal. And I wanted to help people who are coming with a faith perspective or coming from a more conservative perspective to be able to see how these ideas are consistent with those values. So it's not just a health-centered approach to drugs only is something you would support if you vote a certain way or you believe a certain thing. But I wanted to help show people this is consistent if we just want a better world for all of us, really, no matter where you're coming at this from. And it is not inconsistent with what you believe or how you think, the world should run. And so that's why I wrote the book. I wanted to help people to be able to take that journey with me. It really is it's a memoir. It's just kind of a memoir on a mission. It's my story of growing up in West Jackson, starting when I was 9, what I learned about drugs and addiction carries all the way through to the present, and really just is recounting my own learning journey through stories and research that I tell along the way. And one of those things that helped me the most was to learn about Rat Park. That experiment was done in Canada 50 years ago. It's been a long time. And what they did is they took some experiments that were done previously where they had put some rats in this, it's called a Skinner box, but it's basically a little box with
You're
nothing
speaking my
in it,
language
you know?
now. Yeah.
And they gave them options to push a little lever and get heroin injected or cocaine or whatever the drug was they were testing. And they said, well, look what these rats do. They just push the lever over and over and over again, and eventually they'll overdose and die. And so a man called Dr. Bruce Alexander, he looked at that experiment and said, well, wait a second. Rats are highly social creatures. Like, this is a terrible environment for a rat to be alone in a box with nothing to do. So he built, along with his colleagues, what he called Rat Park. And they put these, sawdust all over the floor in their laboratory, and they had all the little wheels and the little tin cans for them to play with, and lots of other rats. So it's kind of this joyful place for a rat. Everything a rat would want in life is part of Rat Park. They also gave them the levers. They could, anytime they wanted to, push the lever to get the drug-laced water or just regular. And they found that the rats almost never pushed the levers for the drug-laced water. And if they did not use it compulsively. It was just every now and then. You almost say it's a recreational use in some way. And so they looked at that and said, this makes so much more sense. And he began to think about how that could translate to the clinic he was working in, because he said, this makes sense with what the people I'm working with who are struggling with addiction are telling me. They're not telling me about the drug and its power. They're telling me about their lives and why they use the drug, which has been absent from so much of the way we think about addiction. So much of the medical context for addiction even has been focused on the power of a drug. But when you look at how many people use substances, very few people become addicted to them of people who have been exposed to them in some way. It is much more about the risk factors that already exist in someone's life and what that drug then sort of connects to in them, what it offers them as a way to, in whatever way it is, feel better than they do right now. Yeah. And so he took that and has been studying addiction using that idea for the last 50 years. He's retired now.
That's the opposite of addiction is connection. So that video, that's the same experiment that they talk about in
Johann Hari is who you're talking about. That came up with the opposite of addiction is connection. That's his TED Talk. That's part of.
It's super powerful, and we play it a lot, and that kind of goes back to what we were just talking about, in that if the way we're treating addiction is threatening the connection that people have in their life, then we're doing absolutely nothing for those people but driving them further into addiction.
Yep. And all of that was radical new news to me. Wow. I did not know any of it. And
it was like a huge eye opener.
Such a huge eye opener, and so heartbreaking for me. So heartbreaking, because now I see this like inverse relationship of it. It was that the more that addiction had taken from someone, the more stigma I held towards them. It was like, if you're at the point where you're living on the street, like you're an especially bad person. Yeah. And now I look at that and say, no. The more it's taken from you, the more compassion there should be for you. Have probably been to hell and back 30 times.
Yeah.
And I think that we have missed that. And that is heartbreaking. Yeah. That our approach is
it was
more stigma rather than more compassion.
It was not very long ago that I was that person. I was literally roaming the streets of Jackson for several months, homeless, looking for my next high. And looking for a place to hide and shoot, whatever, drug I just happened to have available.
And
it wasn't very long ago.
I want to say too, just kind of go back to mothers who've lost their children because of their own addiction, and I have so many powerful experiences working with clients in the work that I do. But at my first treatment center, I would do an all-female group, and in that female group, 9 out of 10 were mothers. And when I tell you that they hated themselves, like they would bawl their eyes out, beat their chest. I mean, just they hated themselves for where they were at with being able to be the mothers that they really wanted to be. And I don't think that society sees enough of that part of it. Like, I just see your consequence. And when I first got sober, I remember being in a meeting, and this guy gave an analogy that was I was like, oh, that right there, that fits for me. But he said that, we're like fish on a hook, in that the rest of the world sees our behavior trying to get off the hook, but they never see the hook. They never see, like you said, what is it that is the drugs and the alcohol are doing for me, and where did that come from? They just see our flailing about and our chaos trying to get off the hook.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. It was really life-changing for me, and has given me so much inspiration from people like you guys who are living. I mean, I just think people living in recovery are the most inspiring people that I get to do life with. Yeah. It just is incredible to see how hard that is, how much work people put into changing everything. I mean, I'm sitting here going, I'm trying to figure out how not to eat the third cookie, but most of the rest of my life is, I'm going to work, and I'm with my kids, and I've got my husband, and, there's a lot that I'm not having to rethink all at the same time. Yeah. And yet, thinking about Joanne, and she is trying to figure out the root causes of her addiction, change all of her behavior patterns, coping patterns, relationship patterns, like the amount of effort that goes into that, which I know I'm speaking to people who know it experientially, and I don't, but just I want the rest of society to know that, to be able to celebrate that and see that incredible strength of people who have come out the other side. You and I share that same desire. I want everybody in that community that are like you to see it from that perspective so badly. And I think that's a huge part of this podcast, is because it's not just to reach those that are still in that darkness and addiction, but the people that do catch it from your point of view and your perspective can see it the way that you see it. I mean, I'm very, very passionate about that. And, man, it's just an honor to have you sitting on the couch today.
There's such a need for people who have overcome addiction to come back and help the next person in line, but there's such a need for people like you that have not dealt with it, but now have a heart for the person still struggling.
And to advocate for, for that.
Yeah.
And if you would have told me, a short couple of years ago that I would be a CEO or founder of my own nonprofit organization, I would have laughed in your face. Yeah. Because my whole life has just, over 30 years of chaotic addiction, from job to job. I bet you I've had over 100 jobs, and all of those job losses were due to, alcohol, drug related instances, most of them, or fired for the, I just, and look what God can do. Look what he did for you. Look what he did. It's just amazing. Danny also. So this guy
Danny.
over here. And Danny.
You just kind of put him in a Palmer category, didn't you?
Kind of a little bit. No. But I'm so glad and happy that you reached out to us to be a guest on the Black Sheep Recovery Warfare podcast. My next question is this, though. You tell a story about your son. He was born a fentanyl. Can you elaborate on that? And
so in the book, actually, I tell the story of him. So, not born connected to it in any way, but when he was 4, he had a really serious finger injury. Got it slammed in a door, incredibly heavy door.
Now, real quick, is this your son or is this
This is my son.
This is your son.
Yep.
Okay.
And So we took him to the emergency room, and he needed stitches to fix his finger. And the nurse comes in and she says, okay, great. Well, I'm going to give him some fentanyl, and then we'll do the stitches in a little while. It's just going to take away the pain. So I'm thinking, I'm already kind of doing this work. I'm hosting these book discussions at the time. And so I've already been rethinking how we're approaching drugs and addiction, and thinking about the lack of quality control that comes when a drug is criminalized, when it's pushed out onto that underground market where there's no, people can sell whatever they want to and whatever quantities they want. And so it was fascinating to me and really kind of shocking, because when we think of fentanyl today, we think death. We think, wow, that's what people are dying from, which is true. And yet, fentanyl has been used for the last 50 years in medical settings. And when it is dosed appropriately and used appropriately, it doesn't cause any problems. You never hear about people dying of fentanyl overdoses who went to the emergency room and got fentanyl. And yet, they're using it every day. And it really illustrated for me the challenge of what's happening now, which is it's not really about fentanyl. It's about the lack of appropriate dosing of a really high potency substance that people are getting. And the reason that they're using it is because when you have a substance that's been pushed into that underground market, the incentive is to make it higher potency, because then it's easier to smuggle. You can smuggle a smaller package and get the same amount of punch in that. Kind of like with alcohol, if you were at a stadium where you can't drink inside, people are smuggling hard liquor. They're not smuggling beer inside. It's like nobody's going for the 6-pack that they're trying to smuggle.
It'd be
they're
a big
just going to
purse,
take,
right? Yeah.
They're just going to take the flask, because it's the same amount of intoxication with a lot less risk in smuggling. And so that same incentive is playing out on a global scale with this underground drug market, where you have so many drugs, and we continue to schedule drugs and push more drugs out into that underground market. The incentive is high potency. And when you combine that with lack of quality control, which there's no quality control, nobody can tell a cartel, hey, wait a second, you didn't put appropriate labeling on your, they don't care. And so when you think about fentanyl, that's why so many people are dying of fentanyl. It's not because they're getting it from a doctor who's dosing it appropriately. It's because they're buying it on the street. And that underground market has said, hey, we can synthesize fentanyl. It allows us to smuggle far less volume of product and reduce our risk and get a whole bunch of people high. Now, some more people are going to die because the risk of using fentanyl unregulated is far greater, because it's a highly potent substance. But the profit incentive of being able to smuggle more drugs with less risk is incredibly compelling. When you think about regular people who aren't trying to break the law are making that same decision when they go to a sports stadium where alcohol is prohibited. Cartels are doing the same thing. They're just looking at the incentives and saying, hey, the higher potency we can get this stuff, the less risk we have to take in smuggling it. And so in understanding why so many people are dying of fentanyl, it's important to understand that's a prohibition problem. It is a problem of lack of quality control plus high potency, which is what you get with prohibition of whatever drug. So it used to be people wanted to use heroin, but they were getting fentanyl. Now it's everywhere. So now there's actually a created demand for fentanyl from people who are now addicted to that or prefer that in some way.
Let me tell you how crazy that is. It's like when it first went out in the streets, like when it hit it hard and heavy, like that's what I want. I wanted heroin. I mean, I didn't seek fentanyl because I think I had some kind of very bad allergy to it, because every time that I shot anything that even had a micro little bit of fentanyl in it, I OD'd every single time. Yeah. I don't know how many times my sister had to resuscitate me, and I don't know how many times I woke up in a emergency room getting hit with Narcan.
Wow.
And my sister, she She got sick of it. She got fed up of having to resuscitate me, and that's what drove me into rehab. Was she was terrified that I was going to die, and unfortunately, before I could get out of rehab, and she passed away from a fentanyl overdose. And you're so right. It's unregulated. It's killing so many people, and
it is this combination of just incredible tragedy, and the path out of it is going to be very painful, because now in bigger cities they have nitazenes, which are really far more potent than fentanyl. So fentanyl is the thing today. It's not the thing we're going to be talking about in 10 years. No. It's just the next step of what is being brought down the pipeline. And so you've got nitazenes. They're far more potent than fentanyl. You've got xylazine in big cities, also more potent than fentanyl. It does not respond to Narcan. It is great. Not, you can't reverse an overdose with Narcan.
That's
on xylazine.
Terrifying.
And it also gives people like deep flesh wounds. It's really, really detrimental to your body. It's a large animal tranquilizer. It is not intended to be consumed by humans. So we have this parade of these substances that are getting worse and worse and worse. And as hard as it is to rethink this approach of just scheduling things, criminalizing them, pushing them into this underground market, the use of illegal drugs has doubled over the last 20 years. So on the one hand, we like to celebrate fewer opioids are being prescribed, but you've got illegal drug use has doubled. This is not a win, because we've got way more people using unregulated substances. That's where fentanyl is. That's where all of this lack of quality control is. And so what we would hope to do is to begin that process of releasing some of the pressure on that valve, where people are getting pushed more and more and more into that unregulated high-potency market, and say, how can we bring great education to people about the risks of drug use, but also open up some avenues for people to be able to access regulated drugs of whatever the thing is that they're addicted to. It used to be 100 years ago, if you were addicted to heroin, you could go to your doctor. They could treat you. They could treat you with heroin. They could give you medical grade heroin. They could prescribe it to you so that you could stabilize your life. You weren't kind of caught up in that rat race of how am I going to get the drugs that I need.
And the consequences that we rack up while we're trying to get the drugs that we need.
Yes. And what they found is that when we used to approach an opioid addiction or an opiate addiction in that way, very few people who struggled with addiction were poor, like 6%. I mean, it's just, we think of our experience of what a heroin addiction looks like today is so much of that just complete chaos and destruction of a life. And 100 years ago, that was not people's experience. It wasn't that heroin didn't cause some problems, but it was that it was approached as a health issue from the beginning. And so you didn't have where people were trying to, hide it, then they were buying it on the street, then they, this whole cycle of getting drawn into this whole different lifestyle. You had people who were able to go to their doctor and say, I'm using this, and I actually think it's really detrimental to my life now. What should I do? And the doctor could say, hey, let's start working on that. Maybe let's start dealing with the root causes of why you're using that. But I'm not gonna just send you out into the street, which is what we do with a lot of people now. If we think they're addicted to something that was prescribed, we cut them off of that. Well, what are they going to do? They're going to go and get what they can on the street, which is going to be unregulated, far more dangerous for them to use, and it's going to cut them off from health care at the point that they need it the most, when they might have a problem and need help for that.
Yeah. So what do we do to reverse the overdose epidemic?
So I think there's a couple things we could do. There's some short-term solutions and long-term solutions. So on the short term, making Narcan available everywhere possible. There's a bill in the Mississippi legislature right now that would expand the amount of different types of groups that could stock Narcan, make that available. That would be amazing. Fentanyl testing strips, those just became legal in Mississippi last year. We can make those broadly available so people can know
if they're dope,
if-
that's heroin.
yes,
I
if-
wish I would
if
have
it
had
is.
that. I'm not.
Right.
I mean, actively when I said that. It was. I didn't want. I mean, I didn't want fentanyl because I knew that was going to kill me ultimately. But I mean, I could. I knew what doses I could use with just regular heroin.
Yeah.
I mean, not to justify using heroin, but it would save lives. Those strips. I mean, I really wished I would have had those.
I think too,
I mean, my sister would probably still be alive.
when I hear these things, I think as far as like from a societal perspective, there's always going to be that person, and I say person, but I mean people, right? that are gonna feel like if I say okay to these things, then I am therefore condoning this person's drug use.
Glorifying it.
I think that was the big stigma associated with when the Narcan first hit. People were like, well, if I'm going to pass out Narcan, if I'm going to pass out clean needles, if I'm going to do this, that, or the third, then essentially I am giving that person permission to still be in their addiction. And so what I love about what you're saying and what your ministry stands for is that is less important than preserving the life of another human being, and I think too, like when it comes to the people in my life that I've lost to opioid overdoses, if you were to ask me what would I do to give that person one more day, and in that day could have been the possibility that it would click for them, I would say anything.
Absolutely.
I would say anything,
Yes.
and it's easy to say that when it's connected to people, that I know. And so there's people out there and they don't know people, right? Or you're talking about somebody else. But if you can for a second put yourself in the shoes of someone who's lost 10, 15, 20 people to opioid overdoses and say, what if that was your mom, if that was your dad, if that was your spouse, what would you want to see happen in that person's life to give them one more chance to get this thing? Anything. I would do anything.
Yeah, so this is the struggle we're all up against. Are we willing to acknowledge that there is no perfect solution?
Right.
And are we willing to embrace the best of the possible solutions that we have? Because what we want, whether you are in recovery and really don't want people using because you've seen how destructive it is, whether you are a mom who has no substance use experience at all, but you don't want your kids using, all of us want the perfect solution. We want the world where
it's okay,
where nobody is harmed by drugs.
Yeah.
We just want them to kind of like poof, just disappear. That's not the world we live in.
Right.
We live in a world that's broken. We all have broken lives. We all have hurts. We all have things we go to that are not helpful. And one of the stories that I tell in my book, Incurious, is about a dad who lost his son to an overdose. And I met him along my own learning journey. We had actually both read Chasing the Scream. He actually emailed me and said, I've seen some of the work you're doing. You need to read this book, Chasing the Scream. I said, actually, I'm leading book discussions on that book. And he said, this has just always stuck with me. He said, if people had to realize that it is a very real possibility that they will lose their loved one, the ideas that sound crazy to them, extreme to them, radical to them, uncomfortable to them, begin to sound much more appealing.
Yeah.
Because we're still kind of stuck in this perspective of thinking that's not the best approach. That doesn't feel like the best thing that
we're not
do.
punishing them enough if we do
yes,
it this way.
Instead of saying they might die if we don't have Narcan available, if we don't have fentanyl testing strips available, if we continue to approach addiction in such a stigmatized way that people don't want to reach out for help because they don't want to admit that there's a problem. Certainly, they don't want to admit they're doing criminal behavior at this point. It's still considered criminal. And so I think that's the thing that we really have to wrestle with, is not what is our ideal solution. It's not what is the perfect one. It's not what do we wish things were like. That's not the world that we get.
Right.
We get a world that is deeply broken with potentially harmful substances in it. It's always going to be that way until heaven.
Yeah.
We get to decide, how can we, number one, help people stay alive? Number two, how can we help them take the next step in their life towards a healthier outcome? It might not be from the bottom to the top immediately. And I think that's another thing I would hope that we can begin to rethink is, can we celebrate small steps along the way that people are taking? I was talking with another father, and his only child died of an overdose when he was still just after he graduated from high school. And he said, I did not, his approach was, every time he fails, I got to just hammer him on that.
Yes.
And,
Everybody
he
thinks that way sometimes.
He has got to know how painful this is for us, what a bad decision he's making. And he looks back on that now. He's had this very big paradigm shift after his son's death and as he began to learn more. And he said, now I look back at, he had gone to treatment, he had been sober for periods of time. He said, now I look back and I think what I wouldn't give to say, Zach, look, I know you just relapsed. You made it 3 months.
Yeah.
I'm so proud of you. You're working so hard to make a better decision in your life. But instead, he only could see the relapse, not the effort, not the time that his son had been able to stay sober or the job he was able to keep or whatever it was, and what he wouldn't give to be able to be the cheerleader instead of the one who's just coming at the point of the relapse and saying, I can't believe we're here again.
What were you thinking?
You know this is not good. And it's such a different mindset, but everything that I have learned about addiction from reading and research and talking with people with lived experience, we're missing it, that we focus always on the negative instead of saying, what's the small step you took? That's awesome, because change happens for most people in small steps.
Right. I love that so much. That's, the approach that I take with my clients too is very much a positive psychology approach, in that no one has ever spoken to me, and I dare say that nobody has ever spoken to my clients crueler than the ways that we've spoken to ourselves. I don't need any help looking at the damage that I've caused. I don't need any help looking at what's wrong here, but I do need some help, and they need some help, and we need some help trying to be able to see, hey, what is still good? What is still right? What are still reasons that I have to try to keep going versus to beat myself emotionally, mentally, spiritually again, back down into the hole that I'm desperately trying to crawl out of. Yeah. So what would you say for the loved one of someone struggling with addiction?
So number one, if you are in Mississippi, really if you're anywhere across the nation, but especially if you're in Mississippi because it's going to be free for you, you can go to alliesinrecovery.net. So there's an organization called Allies in Recovery. We aren't connected to them other than I think they do amazing work.
Yeah.
But they offer training for family members in what's called Community Reinforcement and Family Training. CRAFT is the acronym for it. And it is an evidence-based approach. It's been used for 20 years since it was initially developed. And it teaches family members how to engage with their loved one who's struggling with an addiction in a way that is helpful. And it actually has been proven to increase the likelihood that their loved one will get help.
And that is so good.
And it's not through shaming and blaming.
Yeah.
It is through understanding how it uses lots of different kinds of psychology. But it's really just coming to family members saying, look, chances are your loved one doesn't think they have a problem and they don't think they need help. So that's just the reality we got to start with. And this is a way that you can engage with them that preserves and builds a relationship while also not rewarding them when they're making bad decisions. And so it's not an enabling approach, but it is a connection positive approach. So it allows people not just to, so you have groups like Al-Anon for family members.
Sure.
It's great. That mostly is teaching people how to kind of separate themselves from the chaos and stay healthy for themselves. That's awesome. Allies in Recovery, they teach CRAFT, which teaches you to do two things. Number one, how do you stay healthy? Number two, how do you get in the game with your family member in a constructive way?
Right.
Yes.
Rather than just in that the entering into the chaos, then everybody's mad at each other, everybody's yelling at each other. The hamster wheel that is not positive. So you can, Mississippi is actually grant funded. If you are a Mississippi resident, you can go to alliesinrecovery.net, click on sponsored, and put your zip code in for the promo code. You can get free access to all of their training modules. They have online support groups that are live. You can go, you can connect with other family members that are implementing this. They have skills support groups. You can practice the skills that Craft is teaching you of how to engage, how to communicate, how to listen, how to offer ideas in a way that can be received, and find that moment where there is a little window of opportunity to say, hey, you know, do you want some help thinking about what that next step might be?
Yeah.
It is beautiful. The people there are so compassionate and so wanting to help other families. I mean, the support groups are led by people who are
so
walking
awesome.
with their own loved
Yeah,
ones.
absolutely.
And so definitely take advantage of that. So for family members, get trained in Craft and look to the root causes of the addiction. I mean, that's, you know, just go back to that over and over again, because it's so easy to focus on the behavior of the addiction. It's the thing that you see. It's so much harder to go the deeper route of what's actually driving that. But if we want better outcomes, if we want really to help people, and even to help people not just white knuckle it through sobriety, but like be a healed and whole person, that deeper work is what we really want to support for people.
I use this really, it's not, I don't think that it was, I don't know where I got it from. And my drawing, like it's trash. I can't draw at all. It's not to save my life. But the thing I show to every client in our first session, forever, ever, and always, I draw this little flower, right? And then I take it down to the roots, and I put, you know, addiction is the petal. Addiction is but a symptom. And I'm like, I want to go right here, where the roots at, right?
Oh,
and
I love that.
Yeah, and it's just I'm a you know, visual person, but I think it really kind of drives home for them that I'm not here because of drugs and alcohol, and that doesn't sound right at all, right? Like why am I in treatment if I'm not here for drugs and alcohol? But I'm here for drugs and alcohol because of what is at the root of my inability to sit in reality, to sit with myself, my thoughts, my emotions, right? My fears, my insecurities. Addiction allows us to not have to be with ourselves while we're with ourselves, if that makes sense.
Yep. One of the stories that I tell in the book is a therapist who said he was in recovery from addiction himself, but as he's trying to kind of enter that space for himself and also trying to help other people in that space, he said, you know, what I realized is that I began to have a lot more success. Like my clients started having a lot more success the less I talked about drugs or alcohol, whatever their thing was, and the more that just was kind of off the table. Like, you're not here for drugs and alcohol. Let's talk about what you're really here for.
Yeah,
because that's the drugs and alcohol are they're going to be here or not be here, based on what we do with the underlying thing.
And if we deal with the underlying thing, there's now no need for drugs and alcohol.
Yeah. Yep.
So how can people get connected with what you're doing?
So you can go to enditforgood.com, and we got all kinds of stuff there. There's some freebie resources that are there. You can go buy a copy of Curious if you want that. And I would encourage people, maybe they're listening and they say, yes, I've got family members who need to hear this.
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
fits for me.
And encourage you to maybe give them a copy of the book as a gift. So I wrote the book for people like me who are skeptical, like not people who have some deep knowledge of this or personal experience of this, or maybe who even don't even think that they're really interested in this. I wrote it so that it could reach a wide variety of people. It moves quickly. It's very story-driven. But to really help them rethink this cultural approach to addiction and the policy approach to addiction. But it's not a hard sell on either one. It's saying, look, let's just look at what we know about drugs and addiction now. And let's look at the approaches that we're taking and what we could do to change that so that we can get better outcomes. Because almost every single family is affected by addiction now. It is so widespread that whether or not people are publicly letting that be known, that just is the reality that most people are. And so come get a copy of Curious. Come join us on enditforgood.com. You can sign up for our newsletter. We have a podcast also. Come join us. Social media. join the movement.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Maybe
Join
you're-
the movement. And
maybe you're
I love
skeptical. Come join the movement.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
all in. Come join the movement. There's places for everybody.
I love the title of the book. Curious?
Mm-hmm.
'Cause I'm gonna write a book about Stacy. I'm gonna call it Doctor.
Why are we still doing that? But what your book sounds like to me is just, it's a call. It's a challenge to open-mindedness and to just begin to consider how might we look at this differently, right? And I love that. There's a thing that we do in AA. It's just an acronym. It's HOW. It's honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness. And I think that you can apply those 3 principles to all things addiction related and outside of that, right? But just the ability to say, you know, maybe there's a different way. Maybe the way that I am approaching something could look better, could look different. Maybe there's parts of a perspective I don't understand yet. Like that type of open-mindedness and willingness and humility, I think that goes with that. You know, I think that it could really, really, really change a lot of things, not just for addiction, but for so many of the problems that we see in our society.
Yeah. Half the time we are misdiagnosing
Yeah.
what the real problem
Absolutely.
is.
For sure.
We look at the behavior, we look at the, you know, whatever we can see, and we say, this is what we've got to do to fix it. And we don't take any time to say, what's actually happening there? What's the root cause of this? So that's why my husband actually came up with the name for the book. We had thought through all these different things with the publisher, and he said, he came home from work one day and he said, you know, this whole journey, if you like step back for you and like look at this whole journey you've been on, it has just been this journey of curiosity. Why don't you just call it curious?
That's good.
That's what you want.
That's so good.
That's what
That
you're
is so
hoping
good.
for other people, is just that they would be curious. Not that they must agree, not that, but just, can you just be curious?
Yeah.
Just come journey a little bit, see what we
That's
can learn
awesome.
together, and then let's work together towards a better future.
Amen.
This has been so
This
good.
has been so good. Christina, it's just been an honor to have you in the studio and to talk with us. And this is a copy of her book, Curious. And I would like to present you with.
Hey.
If
Yay!
you'd like
Thank
to
you.
hold that up and
Thank
show it off.
you.
You were an honorary Black Sheep Warrior Princess.
Love it.
And man, it's just like I said, it's just been an honor. I'm going to address my listeners real quick. If you didn't notice, our new website is up on the screen. It's www.blacksheeprecoverywarfare.org. We have an email set up on there that if you would like to be a guest on the show, or to reach out and ask questions, or to get connected with any of the other guests, just shoot us an email. And again, that's www.blacksheeprecoverywarfare.org. And again, we're going to thank our gold sponsor of the month, David Dillmore at Born Again Roofing Company. We are grateful for the opportunity to work with David and his ministry. And, well, that's it for this one. Join us. Join us next time for an exciting episode of Black Sheep Recovery Warfare. Thank you.